Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah ta'ala wa barakatuhu. Welcome to Breaking Boundaries with myself, Bilal Ali Hugh. This is Sky 847. You're watching Safir TV. This week we're discussing challenging racism and stereotypes with the Sunnah of the AhlulBayt. I'm joined by a academic, Sister Amina Inlows. Assalamu alaikum, sister.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Thank you for making the time. I know
My
that you're very
pleasure.
busy, but I really appreciate. And we're also joined by a familiar face on the Breaking Boundaries set, Brother Rashid Rose, who is a mental health commissioner, and I guess in an indirect way, your training has some relevance to the to the topic in some regards.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. So we want to really make the best use of time and just jump straight in with both feet. So I guess what inspired me to put this discussion, this public discourse together, was reading your paper, Racial Othering in the Sacred History of Karbala? And you also did a lecture, but I've now found that the lecture was before. So I guess if I would just ask you, what was the journey that brought you to that piece of work? Very interesting piece of work, but what was the process, I could say?
Well, one can say that the kernel of it was the narration that we often hear in Majalis about Hazrat John, peace be upon him, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, that on the day of Ashura, it is related by some people that he sort of groveled before the Imam, which is good. Groveling before the Imam is good. We don't have any problem with that. Saying my face is black, my smell is bad, I lick the scraps from your table, and, the Imam whitens his face in Jannah, and so on and so forth. Most of us have heard this narration in Majalis, and I've heard any number of people question or even critique it privately, including some people who are rather learned in the scholarly tradition.
Sure.
However, it is very rare for this sort of thing to be discussed publicly. And all I've really done is move some of this discussion into the public sphere, which I think is a bit uncomfortable for some people, but I do think it's a very important discussion to have in our community. And for me personally, I guess I can say this is part of a broader interest I've had in the past few years with respect to how we actually retell the history of Karbala and other aspects of sacred history to construct and send messages about our ideals for religion or our ideals for society or social norms. In many areas. I mean, one of the key areas where this does happen is ideals for women and men, for example.
Yep.
For example, in the Fatimiyya season, you usually hear two genres of majalis. You either hear the women should be invisible, silent, and only come out in society in case of dire emergency strain, or you hear the women should be social activist strain. And both people are using the same sacred history, the same sources, but they're drawing very different messages from it. And this is another aspect of our sacred history which does have social messages that are pertinent to our community today. And that was what I was focusing on here. And it did, as you mentioned, grow out of a lecture. I mean, it's funny how these things do tend to
Snowball.
snowball. I was going to say mushroom, but that's not a nice word. Blossom.
Yes.
I mean, it started originally with a very short lecture, actually, in the holy city of Karbala. It was a private lecture, and it was really random the way it happened. And then I just sort of left the matter. And then,
Just to jump in, how was that received? Because it was actually in the place. As in,
well,
yeah,
I think
on location.
it was in general about portrayals of Karbala. That was only one part of it.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I didn't get any critiques on that part anyway. It is something that bothers people, I would say. A lot of people have come to me since then and said, yeah, this always bothered me, but I just never told anyone, or, well, I always heard it and I always read it and I always thought it was true. But it never really occurred to them that there was any way they could interrogate this or question it. So there was that. And then I did the lecture that is available online. And that sort of,
the lecture in November 2014.
yeah,
Right.
and that sort of snowballed a bit too, in part because I did a little mini experiment and I put some materials that I prepared for my lecture online.
Tell us about that. Was it a Facebook experiment?
Yes, it was. Well, this is, the article that I wrote was basically about two things that were sort of put together. One of them being this actual narration about Hazrat John, peace be upon him. What do our books say about him? Where does this narration, which is very unfavorable to him, when does it come up in our books?
Yeah.
What is its likelihood of authenticity and this sort of thing. But also with some general reflections about how we understand or how we in our community tend to view race/ethnicity and religious authority or religious legitimacy. What is the Muslim or Shi'i race, so to speak, or ideal race? And I did something that actually bothered a lot of people, and that was, I think, really what pushed me to go a bit further with it.
Why do you think there was this bother or this ambivalence, if I can use that word?
Well, what I did that bothered people, just in case the viewers haven't seen it, they missed out on all the fun. I basically went through the narrations we have about the mothers and fathers of the imams, peace be upon them, but I'm emphasizing the mothers because they were more from a variety of regions. And I calculated according to modern standards what we would consider their ethnicity. Now I'm using that very loosely because it's an approximation, and nowadays we do tend to say race is a social construct, but in modern terms, like if I were to say I'm half Japanese and half Indian, we get a sort of 50-50.
We'd have a concept, right? We'd have an idea.
Yeah, so I calculated the percentage ethnicity of the imams. And then I went online and to be honest, I looked for people who I thought fit those ethnic profiles. So for example, and I did lump together a lot of groups because otherwise it's too complicated. So I did actually smoosh together all of the African ethnicities of the imams' mothers. So for instance, one of them might be 75% African, 2% Indian or Iranian, 1% Arab. And so you've got these ethnic mixes, and I made a new picture of the 12 imams because usually we see them all looking the same and generally looking either Iranian,
Indo-Iranian,
Indo, not really. It's usually Iranian or Iraqi, but maybe I've missed out on some photos. And then so I said, well, this is more likely an approximation of what they might have looked like, and then using the most likely narration for Imam Zaman's the origin of his forebears. May Allah hasten his return. I found a nice drawing online. It was subtitled, I believe, as a handsome Moroccan young man or something. It was a drawing, incidentally. It wasn't a photo. And I said, well, this could be what he might look like, especially because he is, mashallah, alhamdulillah, described as handsome and young and so on and so forth. And it wasn't an ugly picture in any way. And then I basically photoshopped them up a bit, the turbans and stuff. And then I shared it online. What do you think of this picture of the imams according to their ethnic profile, so to speak? And yes, some of the comments...
Before you get to the comments, so more accurate, we could say, than the general, commonly used and available artist impression.
Yeah, and that was the point. It was basically to question the idea that we had in our minds, because generally we receive a pictorial image of the imams as being of a certain ethnicity and all being the same. And now there are certain theological reasons for this, there are certain cultural reasons for it, but I was simply putting out something different. And I'll be honest, even when I looked at the picture first, when I made it, I sort of did a double take. I'm like, whoa, this looks really weird. Because I've never seen anything like it before. The imams usually have a certain specific look if you are looking at a picture. Now, of course, the question of whether or not we should be making photos and drawings of the imams is a different question. But I'm saying we most of us have seen them anyway. So then I said, well, let me share this online. And yes, I got a lot of incensed comments. I got many different forms of cursing towards me, that this is, I'm making fun of them. I would say some crude comments, some very racist and derogatory comments. And that in of itself...
I noted a few. I mean, just a few that you mentioned in the lecture. One that said, may the same level of curse be on the person who made this picture as is on Yazid. And I thought, wow, that's a level of, not ambivalence, of outright anger.
Yes, and I think that is very
Didn't sound helpful, but as a student of psychology, it told me less about the picture and more about the psychology of the individual that would have made such a statement. Yeah,
I mean, obviously you're the expert here, but to me it does demonstrate, it's basically the idea that there are certain ideas we hold as sacred, even if they're neither really sacred nor really true. I mean, the picture we have of the imams nowadays that tends to get, photocopied and stuff, it's been around for about maybe 200 years. It has nothing to do with the imamate or the Holy Quran, hadith, wilaya. I mean, it's just a picture. And
just an artist's impression.
This is the sort of thing that some people, if I may be a bit blunt, it's like a sacred cow at Islam. That we have certain ideas, and when someone comes and challenges those ideas, even if they're baseless, then everything breaks loose.
You used a really interesting... I just want to bring Brother Rashid in, but before I do, I just want allude to a point that we'll hopefully get into later on, inshallah. Where you said, I think you said the unwritten orthodoxy. So those things which are not formally part of the religion, but again, I guess like the synonym is a sacred cow. It's not officially taught, but it's what people hold on to so tightly. But it's not part of the Quran and the Sunnah. But hopefully we'll get into that a little bit deeper. Brother Rashid, you smile. Share something with us.
I
Share
really
something.
want to commend this sister on her brilliant work, because it's revolutionary in terms of a thinking process. What she has been able to do is to revolutionize a thinking process from a psychological standpoint as well, because if you bear in mind what I would refer to as the Aryanization of religious leaders, not just in Islam, across the spectrum. We're talking Christianity, we're talking about Buddhism, we're talking about every particular religion have had their leader of some sort replicated into a European type looking person. And what the sister work has done for me, I have subsequently written an article based on your work where I compared the Imams to the Prophet Isa. And graphically, pictorially, you really can recognize who is who. That is how close they look in terms of the depiction of what the personalities are. So I really want to commend this sister on her brilliant work, and I hope later in the program we can get in a bit deeper into exactly what the psychological impact of those pictures have had on certain groups of people, more so than others.
Interesting.
Very important.
Interesting. Sister, the question comes to mind as an academic. I'm just curious to know, what was the type of approach? Was it a literature review, or I mean, how did you go about actually putting together? Because I mean, I read the piece more than once, and I was just blown away. So I'm just fascinated.
Well, the first part of the article is actually quite dull from an academic perspective, and that is, it is really simply hadith analysis and Rajal books from a rather traditional and bland scholarly perspective. Not to insult anyone, but I'm saying basically I just went through a lot of classical/medieval books. I looked, what do they say or not say about Hazrat Joan, peace be upon him? Do they have a chain of narration? Some amount of content analysis. I did slip in another methodology. It is in the footnotes, so the average reader might not notice it unless they're scouring the footnotes. It's called ideological criticism. I used it in my PhD thesis, so that's why it was very fresh in my mind. It's basically about reading the subtext of texts, especially with respect to power structures, sort of implications about what gender, what group, what race, what nationality is empowered in society, what is being unsaid, what is being left out. Because I've been dealing with
Could you repeat that? What is the name? What's the actual name of that methodology?
Ideological criticism.
Ideological criticism.
Yeah, it has been used, to my knowledge, primarily for the Old Testament. For example, to try to glean things about, I want to say minority groups, but in fact they may have been the majority of society, but disempowered groups during Old Testament times. For example, non-Israelites in Israelite history, or women is another one. And so that was also somewhat informing my approach and my analysis. But really largely it was hadith / to a very small degree historically based.
Okay. And you've done the lecture. How do you think it's been received? Mixed feelings, I'm assuming, but some of the kind of feedback that you got.
I haven't actually received any negative feedback to my face once.
What does that mean?
Well, I mean, when I posted that picture anonymously, there were a lot of those
there was a lot of feedback about the
angry,
picture.
inflamed comments.
Yeah.
But to be fair, and I have been told I'm too nice incidentally, but to be fair, having seen the type of dialogue online, I mean, some people, they just say everything online. It's like they don't think about it. They don't think they're talking to another person. And people, it can be very inflammatory online, but the politest people when they see you to your face. I mean, I'm sure, God forbid, but I'm sure you've gotten all sorts of insults online. I mean, I've had people tell me I'm worse than Harun Rashid and God knows what else. You need to go to Hausa and study logic, etc. But when people actually see you, and then you tell them what you have to say this is my proof, these are my footnotes, these are my books, this is my argument, then I think you tend to get a more reasoned comment. And I would say really all of the feedback I've gotten has been quite favorable, and basically along the lines of, like I was saying before, that this is something we've always thought about, but it's just we never really questioned it. I mean, one person was a bit adamant that they had read this negative narration about Hazrat Joan in all the Maqtal literature, so how could I say it's not true? So my response, okay, it's a fair question. What Maqtal literature? From the 20th century? From the 19th century? I mean, you get one narration in the 13th century and you start copying it after that. Well, that doesn't lend any particular credence to it. The fact that, and this is something incidentally, it does relate a bit to sacred cows. The fact that an idea is said a lot does not make it any more true. And even this is mentioned with respect to the hadith sciences. It's something that our classical scholars, both Sunni and Shi'i, emphasize, that if you have a hadith narrated 1,000,000 times, say in the 10th century, and one time in the 9th century, it's as authentic as that one time is. It doesn't matter if you've repeated it a time after that. So just because something is said a lot today, or maybe 10 years ago, or maybe 50 years ago, doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It just means it's become popular or become accepted. Of course, there may be reasons why people are accepting it. I mean, sometimes you do take someone's good judgment with respect to a topic. You say, for example, I follow, I don't know, Ayatollah Sistani, so maybe I trust his judgment on something, but that's a slightly different matter. But yeah, overall, I would hope that this particular inquiry has opened the door to the general subject within our community of how we do portray sacred history and thinking about it. I mean, I would say my sense in general, just in terms of dealing with the community and maybe even teaching Islamic studies too, is because, well, I would say in general as our community, and I spent a fair amount of time discussing this in the lecture, whether or not I needed to or not. We don't always differentiate between how someone is portraying sacred history.
No, this is crucial. This is a central theme, I believe.
Yeah, it is. Versus what actually happened. So let's say, for example, I pick up Tabari, okay, which is pretty, I mean, he's got his messages and his agenda. Yeah. But it's also, you know, he's basically listing out what happened. Now, if I'm going to retell that, say, in a speech, I'm not just going to sit there and read from the book, because if nothing else, it might be a little bit boring, with all respect to Tabari, but it doesn't really have any kick to it, you know? I'm going to use it to give a point.
The orator breathes life into it, right?
Yeah, and there are any number of ways I can frame it with respect to what I think my values should be. And now going back to the sacred history surrounding Imam Hussein, alayhi salam, I mean, one thing you see very easily if you attend a lot of different majalis is that there are different cultural trends in different communities where they frame things differently. So for example, if I go to a predominantly Pakistani majlis, there's going to be certain social values that are going to be emphasized. If I go to a majlis of, you know, quote, reverts in America, there's going to be certain social values emphasized. If I go to a majlis in Najaf, there's going to be certain values emphasized, and so on and so forth. And it is natural. I think it is natural to see Islam or any religion within our own cultural lens, but I think this can be a bit of a slippery slope if we're not actually aware that we're doing it. You know, for example, we do it with the modern era too. There are plenty of Muslims in the 20th century who tried to, for example, emphasize that Islam is scientific or Islam is democratic.
Or whatever. Consistent with feminism and women's rights, and the list goes on.
That's a whole other issue. But the point is, there are any number of ways we do try to frame things. And the important thing is to be able to realize that. And of course, it doesn't mean there aren't truths that we should try to come to. It doesn't mean that it has to necessarily disagree with everything. I'm not saying Islam has to be undemocratic, for example, but just that we should be trying to detect our own biases with respect to how we understand the religion. And I think it's very difficult because usually we pick up these biases subconsciously, and it's only if they're questioned, for example, if someone puts an unusual picture of their moms online, that we actually start to think about them. And most of the time when we respond, you know, when we see something that has some cognitive dissonance, usually the first response is hostility. And it's not just with respect to this. We can think of many examples. Many. Or even with respect to Sunni Shi'i issues. I mean, if you see someone praying on a turba for the first time, you know, sometimes there's hostility because that's not Islam.
Brother Rashid, tell us about your perception of the norms that the literature challenges, questions, or puts under the microscope.
That's an interesting question, Bilal, because before this piece of work came along, I really don't think anyone dare to discuss this particular topic.
Oh, so you're saying openly, so this may be something that happens
and I am quite
in
surprised
the academy, but not
in a sense
in
that
the
the sister haven't received more abuse, let's put it, because it's a very sensitive area. Because a lot of Muslims in both worlds, the Sunni world and the Shia world, have various conceptualization of certain things. And what I mentioned earlier on, what we can refer to as the Aryanization of the leaders, to me is almost deliberate. And like I said, not just Islam suffered from that situation. Christianity also had a very, very similar, what I call a remake or facelift, where Isa alayhi salam was made to look European, deliberately.
Yeah.
And I make mention before, the depiction of the Imam from the artist's impression of what the Imam should have looked like looks no different to what the Europeans caused Isa to look like. So how could you have, it's a serious situation where you have your leaders being depicted as such. Coming from a minority background, from a minority position, it tends, or it can make one feel somewhat inferior if you're not
unconsciously.
I was about to say that, yes. Can make one, if you're not really conscious of your whole self and the whole persona, it can fit you into a little box, and you may develop an inferiority complex. And I believe the color overtones given to respective leaders from various religions is no accident. I think they were deliberately done for political, social, and economical reasons. And we can see the impact that it's had in Europe since, like I said, Isa alayhi salam was made to look a certain way. That particular image have been used to colonize a whole group of people.
So psychological
So I am looking at it from the psychological perspective, a student of psychology myself, looking from the impact it has had on certain groups of people more so than others. So I am really, really pleased that the sister had the nerve to rise up and almost challenge the status quo and had the nerve to go through with it. And I really hope whatever she's doing is continue to grow, because this message need to get at, and we need to address these false concepts of the imams looking a particular way and not a certain way. Very, very significant that we use these mediums to address it. Academically, of course.
Yes.
We're not causing assertions and trying to make mischief. These are issues because people are literally afraid to address these issues. It's like taboo. Oh my God, you don't dare say certain things. But if you don't speak the truth, people will always remain ignorant. So yes, programs like these must play a role in reshaping the thinking process of the mass of people, Muslims, and religious people, full stop.
And I think it's actually ironic, because the article that you drew from, or the narrative that you drew from, wasn't specifically, say, for example, like a Quranic narrative, but it's the narrative of Imam Hussein, and Imam Hussein is standing, alayhi salam, he's standing for truth, is standing for, okay, even if it's a tyrant, even if your back is against the wall, speak the truth. And there's a quote you made in one of your speeches, I think you quoted a professor who said, prophets come to shine light on the dark places of the people, to challenge the status quo. So, the imams, plural, or the prophet, the Sunnah in general, is not to sit comfortable with orthodoxy if it's about injustice. So, yeah, intriguing as it is.
Very
But
intriguing.
again, I must tax you a little bit more, sister, to find out what is the most common messages. The most common messages from you'd say from the history, sacred history of Karbala. What was the most common?
Well, I think that's actually a very complicated question, and one that does evolve over time. And I have to say, I haven't really looked at, say, the 13th century, the 14th century, the 16th century, how messages were evolving. I would say, to my understanding, with respect to what happened in Karbala, if you look, for example, at the Maqtal of Abi Mikhnaf, it's quite compact, if you will. I don't find it's very heavily message-based. And if you look at some of the other tragedies in sacred history with respect to AhlulBayt, alayhimus salam, for example, Kitab Sulaym ibn Qais and Saqifa and the attack in the house of Hajjat Fatima, peace be upon her. There are some messages, and actually quite a lot of messages that are associated with that. So even though that is our earliest surviving book that is written by a Shi'i pen, whether it was written by him or someone else, it's not really just a report. It's a report with a purpose. But I think it probably took some time to develop messages associated with various parts of the Karbala history. And of course, in the 20th century, we did have this divergence, which I alluded to with respect to the history around Fatima, peace be upon her. That on the one hand, it's what Ali Shariati called black Shiism and red Shiism. That on the one hand, you have the traditional, we recite this to cry and get thawab, and then we basically, drink our chai and go home. And then you have the, no, we recite this because we need to learn from it and make change in society and revolutionize society and bring about justice in society. And I do think, personally, I do see both of these still today. I mean, you go to some majalis for thawab.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it.
Simple as that, yeah.
There's a recitation and you listen. And I'm not saying necessarily that's bad. I think, at least for me personally, that has a place in my spirituality and my expression. But I do get bored on a diet of that alone, honestly, because it doesn't really have a lot of teeth. And it doesn't really motivate people to make changes in their lives. And I think a lot of people nowadays, they do want a more relevant discussion.
So like a socially conscious then?
Yeah, socially conscious is the right word. Now, I do think there's a danger with that, in that I have seen in our era, people do ascribe messages to Imam Hussein that, honestly, I think if you really look at what is recorded as being quoted from him, it's very difficult for me to actually justify the idea that he actually said this, or he did this, or he taught this. Now, whether he would have is another matter. You might say it was concordant with his beliefs, or I can derive this from this. I mean, I feel like sometimes people go a bit too far.
Stretching.
Yeah, they do stretch it. And I think maybe that can be bad insofar as, they may necessarily not have the right message.
Sure.
And they may be making a mistake. And that can, God forbid, turn people against the Imam. So there is a balance. But that is what I think is really the tension we have today. And we'll see where things go.
We'll see where things go. So we've outlined we've laid the foundation to the conversation. And we're going to stop briefly for a short break and hope to hear from you on the other side on 0203 515 1234. But until then, Assalamu alaikum.